Good afternoon and welcome. It's my privilege on behalf of the law school and the law school faculty to welcome you. I would particularly like to welcome Doug's family, his wife Ruth, as well as Ellen and Catherine and Mary, and Doug and Ruth's grandchildren. Today we celebrate the life of a wonderful person, a beloved teacher, a tremendous scholar, and a terrific colleague who for 50 years left his mark on the school. Community is so important to this law school, and Doug represented the very best of this community. I know I speak for all of us on the faculty and the staff when I say his brilliance, his kindness, and how he deeply cared about his students and his colleagues and this school will not be forgotten. I'm not going to speak for long. My job is just to introduce, but I did have something that I learned this past week that I wanted to share with you. It made me smile, and although I only knew Doug for a few years, I think it captured nicely his lightheartedness and his humor. This week, a few students who are now 3L students but had him as a first-year student shared with me a list of 2 pages that they had written down quips and tidbits of advice that Doug had given to them during the first-year contracts class. And it was titled, I think quite appropriately, Bosch Wisdom. I'm not going to read them all. Not all of them would be appropriate, but there was a couple. There was a couple that I thought were worth sharing, at least that I got a chuckle from. So don't try to go it alone at law school. You need someone to tell you that you are a cuckoo. We've got visitors. Quick, act smart. I was going to send you the problems last night, but I had a little too much wine. Unfortunately, it's worn off. And I think my favorite, if you ever get caught and someone asks you who taught you contracts, you say Bill Hicks. I think we're going to miss Bosch Wisdom. Lastly, before turning it over to our next speaker, I really wanted to thank Doug's family. Doug's family has decided to memorialize Doug's legacy at the law school by creating an endowed scholarship in an honor, and so appropriately it's directed at students to help them financially while they're here at the law school. The family have not only generously created the scholarship, but they've pledged to match any gifts made up to a total of $50,000. And I have to say, just this week I've been had some meetings with alumni, and I was telling you earlier, I met with somebody and sat down, and the first thing they did was say, look, Dean Parrish, before we talk about anything, and they gave me $1,000 to say this is for Doug and his scholarship. I thought that was tremendous. If you're someone who's touched by Professor Boshkoff and like to contribute, information is outside. But on behalf of the entire law school community, thank you, Ruth, and thank you for the family for doing something special. At this time, I would now like to introduce the Provost of Indiana University, the Dean of our law school from 2003 to 2011, and someone who knew Doug as a student, as a colleague, and as a friend, Lauren Robel.
Well, I'm honored to have an opportunity to say how much I loved and admired Doug Boshkoff. Doug was my splendid teacher in 2 classes where I too saw him climb up on that perilous ledge, which I remember vividly because I think the occasion was the Northern Pipeline versus Marathon case, which was decided the year I took bankruptcy from Doug. I remember that class as well because we had a thick pile of mimeographed materials from Doug from which he taught that class, I think in part because Marathon was about to be decided, and that I still own. He was a witty, humane, and wise teacher. And after he died so suddenly, I heard from many of my own classmates and students who were shocked and saddened and just wanted to touch base. One alum, Steve Tratner, who was in Doug's contracts class in 1967, wrote, I still remember my first class with him and Hawkins versus McGee, which was the first case of my legal education almost 40 years ago. Professor Boshkoff was a master of the Socratic method. I used his way of asking questions throughout my over 40 years as a trial lawyer. By doing so, I was never surprised with new facts or contentions, and that is a major reason why I was almost always much better prepared than my adversaries. Professor Boshkoff had a profound positive influence on my legal career. Well, thousands of students could say the same thing, as Doug's influence as a teacher spread out across the profession, just as his scholarship spread out across bankruptcy doctrine. I too remember all this from Doug and more, such as his kindness to me as a young mother who showed up in one of his classes trailing a mildly, and I stress that, mildly sick 5-year-old and a big box of crayons. His concern for Anna was so characteristic of the humanity he practiced daily. And his mild scolding of me was uncharacteristic of the time. Doug was a treasured colleague for 30 years and my trusted advisor when I was associate dean and dean. In every one of those roles, he epitomized collegiality of the highest order, which was made up in equal parts of warmth, humor, friendliness, and generosity, and then a really outsized portion of hospitality. So many of us experience Doug's hospitality that I feel confident that my experiences will sound familiar. While I was still at the Court of Appeals in Chicago, Doug sent a warm letter welcoming me to the faculty and offering his help. While Steve and I were still unpacking, we received a dinner invitation from Ruth and Doug. His door was the door that was always open. His ear was the ear that was always available. And his advice was the advice that was always right. Not that he gave unsolicited advice on law school matters, other than the advice on art that was implicitly always welcome because we all relied on him for that. I would have to solicit, and sometimes the answer would be a simple, "That's a tough one, Lauren." That observation usually preceded a kind of gentle Socratic questioning that led me always to a better thought. And it is a great illustration of Henri Nouwen's aphorism that hospitality is not to change people, but to offer them space where change can take place. Doug graciously offered me that space and offered it to hundreds of others in the years we were privileged to be his colleagues. Whenever I left his office, he'd call out, "Good luck, Lauren." Doug's grateful colleagues are spread across the world. After Doug died, I received an email from Yangshin Sung. Mr. Sung had come to our law school from Hangzhou, China, as a visiting scholar in the early 80s, when such visits were rare, and soon was on the receiving end of Doug's hospitality. He wrote about how wonderful Doug's bankruptcy class was, which he attended almost 30 years ago, and how with Doug's encouragement, he had translated the first Chinese bankruptcy law. Doug and Mr. Sung co-authored an article on Chinese bankruptcy law for the American Bankruptcy Journal, and they stayed in touch. His email ended, "Professor Boshkoff was a really kind friend. I am truly grateful to him for his generous help and his support, and I will always cherish those vivid, unforgettable memories of him. His spirit will stay with us forever as an encouragement for us in our future work and life." The last time I saw Doug was at the reunion of the class of 1965 just last October. He was surrounded, as usual, by admirers, and as usual, when we parted, he said, "Good luck, Lauren." Good luck, Doug, wherever you are. Thank you from all your admirers, who all hope you are ensconced in the heavenly version of Raintree County's library. Thank you.
Nobody ever wants to follow Lauren at anything. Doug Boshkoff was, as you all well know, an extraordinary man. In fact, a truly unique one. One of the areas in which this was, I think, especially true was his teaching. As the Indianapolis Star noted in its obituary of Doug, second only to his family, Doug loved teaching. He taught a lot. Long after retirement, he taught more than 10,000 law students. He taught more than 1/3 of the practicing lawyers in Indiana. His excellence in teaching was recognized by generations of law students and his peers, who awarded him the Gavel Award, the Leon Wallace Teaching Award, the Frederick Bach Lieber Teaching Award, Indiana University's highest recognition for exceptional teaching. Now, the key to Doug's success was that he loved his students, and there is no doubt that they loved him. And one of the many ways in which he demonstrated that love was through the annual recitation of a poem about one of America's most famous contract cases, Sherwood versus Walker. You, if you're in this room, will recall this 1887 Michigan Supreme Court case held that a contract to sell a cow, thought by both the breeder-seller and by the banker-buyer to be barren and therefore destined for the meat-packing house, could be rescinded when the parties discovered that the cow was, in fact, pregnant and therefore far more valuable than originally thought. That case was important for its holding on mutual mistake, but another reason it has persevered so long is the central character that is the core of the dispute, the cow. Rose II of scheduled to be sold at 5.5 cents per pound, lest 50 pounds shrink. To bring to life the story of Rose II of Aberloan, and to the delight of generations of his students, each year Doug would recite to his contract students the famous poem about the case and the cow, written in 1951 by UCLA law professor Brainerd Curry. 'Twas the middle of night on the Greenfeld farm, and the creatures are huddled to keep them from harm. Ah me, ah moo. Respectfully their quidsim how mournfully they chew, and one there is who stands apart with hanging head and heavy heart. Have pity on her sore distress, this norm of bovine loveliness. Her gentle limbs, her hornless brow, proclaim no ordinary cow. Fairer as a pasture, sweet with hay, mown in the very month of May. Nay, fairer yet, and yet more fair. She stands alone, the short black hair heaving sometimes on her breast, shunned and despised by all the rest. If one should ask her why she doth grieve, she would answer, sadly, I can't conceive. Her shame is a weary weight like stone for Rose II of Aberloan. Now, the poem goes on quite a bit. 12 printed pages, in fact. And one of the many things that made Doug remarkable was that rather than read the poem to his class, Doug decided to memorize the entire poem and perform it for his students on the last day of the course each year. Now, Ellen wrote to me, and I quote, "Of course it took him a long time to memorize it. I recall being in the car, we took long car trips as kids, with my dad sitting in the front seat working on memorizing the poem." I suspect those were very long trips. It is a special memory of ours that we witnessed his dedication to teaching and persistence and his sense of humor as he diligently worked to memorize the poem. Ultimately, Doug bought a T-shirt with a cow on it, and he would wear that under his button-down collared shirt to be revealed to the dramatic moment, of course, all to the delight and to engage his students. They took her that October morn, before the dew was off the corn, to the cattle yard with its sinister scale, the better to finish the dreadful sale. Never had coat such glossy sheen. She was less a cow than an exiled queen. She walked with dignity and pride, and as good George Graham stroked her side, he descried a light rotundity, evincing, he fancied, fecundity. And he read in her mute, appealing eyes a message that caused him glad surprise. He caught his breath and must not be blamed if his voice was broken as he exclaimed, "Rose, you're about to become a mother." She blushed and replied, "Ich kann nicht utter." But they reckoned without the banker Sherwood. Now one would have thought that this gauchious cur would withdraw from this tender and moving scene, but the banker's heart was little and mean. He twirled his mustache in his bill of sale, and the words he uttered turned Walker pale. "I am come to claim such as is my own, to wit, Rose the Second of Aberloon." Now Walker the breeder was having none of this, and his refusal to deliver up the cow gave rise to the case. And following a lengthy and erratically rhymed discussion of the court's decision in 1887, the poem ends 75 years later. 'Tis the middle of the night before the exam, and there's nothing to eat but a cold bit of ham. Ah me, ah moo. Mark how the eager students cram, what coffee black they brew. A dismal specter haunts this wake, the law of mutual mistake. And even the reluctant drone must cope with Rose of Aberloon. She rules the case, she stalks the page, even in this atomic age. In many a subtle and sly disguise there lurks the ghost of her sad brown eyes. That she will turn up in some set of facts is almost as certain as death and taxes. For students of law must still atone for the shame of Rose of Aberloon. Now the story would just end there, but it doesn't. In 1991, Doug published in the New York University Law Review his own collection of legal poetry, a set of limericks with the mischievous title, Selected Poems on the Law of Contracts, Raintree County Memorial Library, Occasional Paper, number 1. And in that collection we find, we've all heard the story of Rose, whose failure to bear was a pose. For the stewpot I'm not, said Rose like a shot, and the court said the deal couldn't close. So it is now my pleasure to introduce Bruce Markell, our former colleague at the law school, Doug's good friend and mine, and welcome back.
Thanks very much, and I appreciate the invitation to come back, not only to IU, but to Indiana. As many of you may know, I'm from Indiana, actually. I remember, if you look at the license plates now and you see 200, I was here when they said 150. And I actually remember that. I'm going to keep my remarks short. Doug would have liked that. And I'm going to try and talk about his role as a mentor. I came to IU in 1990, fresh young professor, or not so young at that point. And as Doug later told me, I was supposed to be his replacement. Now, no one could replace Doug. But we taught the same things. We had the same interests in bankruptcy and contracts. And Doug never really took anybody under his wing, but Doug was always there with advice. And Doug very generously would let me attend his classes to try and understand his method in terms of what he was doing. And I would follow him back to his classroom, kind of like a little puppy, and say, why did you do this? Why did you do that? He was very patient. He would explain things. And occasionally, some of the things would surprise me. Once, we were in a class, and every class has the occasional student who is annoying. They ask far more questions than they really want to know the answer to. They just want to be known for asking the question. And Doug that year, unfortunately, had one of those. And this student during the class was trying to monopolize it. And finally, Doug looked at him and said, that is answered by the case of Fay versus Jones, 227, Indiana 1, 1891. He goes, oh. And I go, afterwards, I go, Doug, how did you remember that? He goes, I made it up. He goes, you just have to shut down those types. So, and he was good at making a point. We all know, and the pictures exist of him standing on tables to make points. And not only did he teach students, I've used that technique several times in my class. It's effective. I would warn you, though, test the table before you do it. But what I came to talk about primarily today was his scholarship. It endures today. It is something people is still read. His piece in Pennsylvania with respect to comparative bankruptcy has relevance just as much today as it was published when it was published 20, 30 years ago. His American bankruptcy law articles are key, are interesting, they're award-winning. Actually, the story on that is I was, again, at the time young, trying to establish articles. I had an article accepted by the American Bankruptcy Law Journal. Doug was very supportive. And so I'm working away, and I was talking to the editor-in-chief. I knew Doug was always working on not one, but many things at any one time. And so the editor-in-chief said, if you know anybody, we've got a space that came open. And I said, well, maybe I know somebody. So Doug's office was 3 doors down. I had to go by Cate. I had to go by Hicks. Go in the office. I go, Doug, I don't know what you're working on, but if you care, there's, the American Bankruptcy Law Journal say they have a spot and they can publish you relatively quickly. Doug goes, well, thank you very much. The next I heard of that was when Doug won the award for the best article in the American Bankruptcy Law Journal. And then the editor-in-chief, who I know and still know, says, you were a close second. And I said, thanks. Being second to Doug Boshkoff ain't bad. But what we know about his scholarship, what people remember about his scholarship, are the limericks and the haiku. And I'm here to tell you 2 stories about them. One, the birth, and one, the almost death. The birth, I can say, with confidence, I was there at the birth of the limericks. Now, the birthplace is a place you might not appreciate. And in fact, if you're lucky enough to go to the reception afterwards, you will be there. It was in the faculty lounge. We were having a faculty meeting. Now, Doug, and this is a quality I really appreciated about him, hated faculty meetings. Not much ever gets done in a faculty meeting that's worthwhile. Sometimes it does. And Doug would get there usually early, would sit in the corner. He would have some work. He'd have a piece of paper. He didn't want to appear that he was too disconnected. But he was always kind of dour. He was always kind of sitting there. And this one faculty meeting, I'm sitting across the room, and he's chuckling. Now, Doug chuckling is an interesting sight. But Doug chuckling in a faculty meeting is a rarity. So I'm just sitting there, and he keeps going. He keeps scratching some of that piece of paper. And he's laughing. And so finally we have a break. I go, Doug, what is going on? I said, there's got to be something going on because you don't laugh at faculty meetings. This wasn't that funny. I can remember the meeting. It wasn't that funny at all. And so he just looked at me, had a yellow pad. He turned it around, pushed it to me, and I read the limerick about Shirley MacLaine and for the first time. And I laughed. And I said, Doug, this is golden. What are you doing? He goes, well, I do these from time to time. I've been working on it. I says, I've got a bunch of them now. I said, well, you ought to do something with these. And so he needed my encouragement, but he collected them. And he actually, as Professor Cate said, got them published in the NYU Law Review. Now, as we say in the biz, that's pretty good placement. NYU's is a good law review. And now, after the birth, I want to tell you the story of the almost death. So Doug announced he had been accepted at NYU. We're all very happy. And one day he comes into my office. Now, you have to understand if you haven't read the articles, if you just read the limericks, that's fine. But all the articles have about a page and a half introduction that Doug made up. I mean, these were found in the Raintree County Memorial Library, which is, it's actually a mythical county based on Henry County, Indiana. And he made up a story of how these were found in a book on the life of Samuel Williston. Very intricate, detailed story. but completely fabricated. I mean, it's just a tissue of falsehoods. And so Doug comes to my office and he sits down. And he looks at me and he goes, I got a problem. I go, what's the problem? He goes, NYU doesn't want to publish. I go, what, are they crazy? He goes, well, I'm talking to the editor. And the editor goes, well, we probably need clearance from the library. And Doug said, excuse me? He says, yeah, no, I mean, if they found this in the library, it's their property. If you're going to reprint them, I mean, even with your footnotes and annotations. And Doug said, this is fiction. It's made up. He goes, oh, that's fraud. Proving again that law students across the ages have the same sensibilities of reality. But I said, I have to talk to my editor. We have to talk to our advisor. And it was after this phone call he comes down to my office. So, I mean, I knew some people at NYU. I knew people who knew people at NYU. The story is that within 2 days they had called back and said, oh, of course, well, we were just kidding. An appropriate story to tell on April Fool's Day. But, you know, and he got it published. And he published another one in Northwestern in 1996. And he actually then he switched forms. He went to haiku in 2007. They're all brilliant. They're all Doug. And I mean, I came down from Chicago, drove down yesterday. If you remember, yesterday was a stormy day. And it was a stormy day with lots of rain, thunderstorms. But occasional, as I was driving into the storm, there was sun behind me, and there was this beautiful rainbow to the left. And it basically kind of showed me Bloomington. Thanks, Doug.
I joined the faculty in the summer of 1978, and the culture in the law school at that time, and for several years later, was quite different from today's culture. In 1978, the full-time teaching faculty numbered 18, plus 4 newly hired members, including me. Most faculty were in the law school office every weekday, arriving in the morning and usually leaving for home in late afternoon. Faculty office doors were kept open during each workday, and there were no computers. So we wrote out our class notes and composed letters by hand on yellow legal pads and turned them over to our secretaries, who typed them for us. Now, I look back with fondness on those days, but what I will never forget were 2 unexpected blessings that I received at the outset of my tenure at IU. First, I was assigned to the 3rd floor faculty office right next to Doug. For the next 37 years, we were not just colleagues, we were neighbors who became very good friends. The second gift was the faculty custom of sharing lunch together in what was then the faculty lounge on the 2nd floor of the law school. Doug and I were always there as participants, together with Harry Prater, Maury Holland, Bill Popkin, Roger Dworkin, Pat Bode, and frequently Val Nolan. This daily social gathering helped acquaint me with my new colleagues. It also provided me with visible evidence of how much these colleagues respected Doug. In my opinion, what was essentially distinctive about Doug was his character and his boundless enthusiasm for life. He was gentle, honest, trustworthy, and patient. Today I would like to mention a few of the memories I have of Doug that have little to do with his accomplishments as a teacher and scholar, or with the legal discussions that the two of us enjoyed in the law school. These memories are important, but for me, so are the memories that reflect Doug's joyous spirit. Doug manifested his enthusiasm in a variety of ways. As many of you know, Doug and Ruth loved to travel and loved to cook, with Doug taking the lead with hors d'oeuvres and the entree, and Ruth creating gourmet desserts. When my wife Karen and I were invited to dinner at the Boshkoffs, we sometimes sat at the kitchen table, sipping red wine that Doug had selected, and watching him preparing the meal. He appeared as marveled when he was tasting a sauce in a pan on the stove as he was when savoring the finished serving at the dining room table. When Doug and Ruth arrived for dinner at our home, Doug would regularly head first into our kitchen, wanting to know what Karen was preparing and inquiring about the ingredients in the recipe. Karen always interpreted Doug's questions as a compliment of her cooking. Doug's enthusiasm was also evident in his numerous avocations. For many years, he raised violets in his greenhouse. In the early 2000 years, he discovered a money circulation tracker on the website called Where's George? I recall walking into Doug's office and watching him use a rubber stamp to mark a stack of $5 bills with www.where'sgeorge.com. He also entered his zip code and the serial numbers of each bill into the website database. Later, he purchased groceries or other commodities with the doctored $5 bills. Each day thereafter, he would consult the website, which reported the sightings and the time between the sightings of Doug's $5 bills. Doug found great pleasure when the website database revealed that some of his $5 bills had shown up in Europe and in other places around the world. More recently, Doug combined another hobby with extraordinary empirical research. He discovered the availability and the potential value of banknotes that were issued by Indiana chartered banks prior to 1861, when Congress authorized the first series of federally issued U.S. banknotes. Many of these Indiana banks were located in places such as Gosport, Indiana, that no longer have a bank. So he also visited some of the small towns where the banks were established to learn what he could about their success or often their demise. Doug purchased 40 Indiana banknotes that were issued from 1815 to 1859, most of which were signed by a bank executive at the time of their issuance. The notes had artistic engraving with vignettes with subtle background color in a variety of denominations of 50 cents to $10. Doug arranged the banknotes in an album accompanied by detailed historical notes, which Doug wrote. His collection, entitled Indiana Banknotes, Ephemera, 1815-2004, is held now by the curator of manuscripts at the IU Lilly Library. When Doug and Ruth were on vacation outside the United States, I always look forward to receiving a short message from Doug on a postcard or an email. Whatever the form, the communication to me usually included a little spark of adventure. Here's an example, an email that Doug sent me on June 8th, 2012. Greetings from southern France as I struggle with a manual shift. A good day. I only stalled once and did not hit anything. Beautiful scenery and great food. Wish you were here. BGB. As that email indicates, Doug had a great sense of humor. I loved his laughter and his harmless and clever teasing of me. Here's one illustration that I clearly recall taking place in the law school. I was sitting at my desk with my office door open, and my office was cluttered with boxes and papers on the floor. And by the way, Doug's office was always clean. I could hear Doug's footsteps coming down the hall towards me. He stopped in front of my office with his contracts casebook in hand, looked in at the boxes, and with a twinkle in his eye said, the dean asked me to tell you to clean up your office. And then he was gone. Now, I knew from experience that Doug would revise that ribbing and communicate it to me in a way that I had seen many times before on different topics. Sure enough, a week or two later, I heard Doug's slow-paced walk approaching my office, with my door open and my office in the same condition of untidiness as before. Doug stopped, surveyed the room, and without saying a word, shook his head back and forth and rolled his eyes as he continued on. In closing, I want to share a comment that Doug made to me on 2 or 3 occasions in the past few years. He said, the hardest part of growing old is having to say goodbye to your friends. Each time he said that, I thought I knew what he meant. I didn't. But now I really know. I invite Ruth Boshkoff to the podium.
When Doug was offered a 1-year replacement for an IU law professor on sabbatical, we were more than ready to move from Detroit, where we were living. For one thing, at Wayne State, Doug had to teach night classes. And that was rather difficult because by that time we had 3 children, age 4, 2, and a newborn. So Doug, when he got this wonderful offer, went by himself to Bloomington to make arrangements for us to move here. I can't remember how many times he told me about how he came into town on 3rd Street from Nashville that day. It was just about this time of the year, just almost exactly, I think. It was in April, and you all know how beautiful Bloomington is now. Well, Doug, looking all around him at resplendent blooming trees and flowers and greenery, was smitten. And when he began his long journey as a teacher at the law school, he fell in love with teaching. He fell in love with the law school, with his colleagues, with his students. He fell in love with everything about the law school. As a matter of fact, he really didn't want to retire at all. He really didn't. But characteristically, he did so because he did not want to shortchange his beloved students. Doug and I made a wonderful life for ourselves here in Bloomington. My children and I are very appreciative of the law school family and all the other like circles in Bloomington that have sustained us throughout our lives and continue to do so now. So my family and I would like to thank you very much for honoring our husband and our dad today. Thank you.
It's hard to go last because some of your material is taken by other speakers. So we're going to have to improv here a little bit. My name is Ellen, and my sister Catherine, my sister Mary. There's 4 Boshkoff girls, but one could not be here today. But we just wanted to say a few things. Sort of as an intro, I think that you realize if you knew my dad, he was a dedicated scholar and a very prolific writer. He authored 3 books and more than 70 articles during his career, including several that were very influential in bankruptcy. And he was very proud of that. But there was one little essay that I think he was the most proud of, and it's this one, the NYU Limericks collection. And this was this little essay that stood alone for him. And for those of you that don't know, he wrote a limerick on every major case in contracts, first-year contracts, and then on a few other topics, too, that are related to contracts. But I think this perfectly represents our dad. The collection is scholarly. Every limerick is footnoted, cited, explained. It's educational. He put this up on the blackboard to introduce the new contracts case. But it's also very witty and permeated with this sly sense of humor. And so because I think this combined so many things that are special or were special about our dad, we wanted to just read a few. So the first one, we've already heard about this case, the case of the hairy hand, Hawkins versus McGee. And this was where a botched hand surgery gave rise to a claim for damages, and the issue in the case was what were the damages, and they were expectation damages, which means the benefit of the bargain. So Mary will read that one.
A terrible need for a fee brought great grief to Dr. McGee, and his promises airy led a patient unwary to a hand that no mortal should see.
The second limerick is about the parole evidence rule, which is basically the rule that you can't use extrinsic evidence to alter the terms of an integrated contract. And this case involved a contract for the sale of land, and the seller allegedly orally agreed to remove an ice house on an adjoining piece of property that was apparently an eyesore. And this promise was held not to be enforceable because of the parole evidence rule. This is Mitchell versus Lath.
The writing gave nary a clue as to what the seller must do. So, like it or not, in the very same spot is the ice house still blocking the view.
And finally, we were going to read the limerick to the lovely Rose, but I've swapped in new content since we've already heard that one. And this is one of my particular favorites. It's not based on a case, but rather a famous law school hypothetical illustrating the principle that when you have a unilateral contract where performance is the acceptance of the contract, at some point, part performance creates this option contract which binds the offeror. So unilateral contract, how far do you have to walk across the Brooklyn Bridge if the promise is, or the request is, walk across the Brooklyn Bridge? So he wrote this limerick. Ode to the Brooklyn Bridge. A bridge never meant to be crossed. If it were, then all would be lost. Those hypos inane, law students in pain, and debates until Hades' first frost. Now, another thing that's been mentioned today, and I also recall this clearly, it was at or around the time that I was graduating from law school that these were being written and published, was the debate with the NYU Law Review, and in particular a law student, about whether it was appropriate to have a fictional introduction. For one thing, that is hard to create a Blue Book cite for. The citing cannot be appropriate. So there was a debate, and what the law student wanted my dad to do was to admit up front that this was fictional and a joke, which of course he did not want to do, because part of the great joke of this is this lovely little essay in the beginning talking about Raintree County and the library, which of course is a fictional place, which my dad also thought anyone that had any level of education should know. So he shouldn't have to explain the joke. So that's what I recall the debate was. And they eventually resolved their differences by my dad agreeing to put in a footnote, but not at the beginning, at the very end. And so the very, very end of this, footnote 68, is a little footnote that explains the joke. And Catherine is going to read that to you. I also think it's a very appropriate way to end this, because Raintree County was one of my dad's favorite books. And this describes a fictional place where it's summertime and the sun is shining. And so I think we'll close with that.
It reads, the original manuscript containing these poems is one file in the archives of the Raintree County Memorial Library. It is not, however, available for inspection.
That's explaining the joke. That's all you get.
There's a little bit more. As Ross Lockridge once wrote, hard roads and wide will run through Raintree County. You will hunt it on the map, and it won't be there. For Raintree County is not the country of the perishable fact. It is the country of the enduring fiction. The clock in the courthouse tower is always fixed at 9 o'clock, and it is summer and the days are long. So now we're going to conclude the program by hearing a brief clip of my father speaking of his first visit to the university, and I think it's very fitting to hear this on a fine, early April day.
Talk a little bit about my memories of the law school and of some people that were around here a few years ago. I thought I might start by explaining how I came to Bloomington, which just shows you how much chance there is in academic life. Paul Carrington and I were teaching fellows together at Harvard in 1957-58. And I then went to teach at Wayne State University. And Paul went to teach at Wyoming and then moved from Wyoming to Indiana. And Paul decided to visit at Ohio State in the fall of 1962, and he eventually ended up going over to Ohio State. And the law school was looking for somebody to fill in for Paul, and Paul suggested that I taught in some of the same areas that he did. And that's how I came to be down in Bloomington. It was just a very fortuitous opportunity for me. And I remember coming down to talk to Dean Wallace about what I was going to be doing the following year. And I flew down from Detroit on an early morning flight on Delta and left Detroit about 6:30 in the morning and arrived in Indianapolis about 7:30. And the dean met me, and it was one of those gorgeous April days. I'll never forget it, where all the dogwood and the crabapple and the cherry trees are all in bloom and the daffodils are up and a bright blue sky. You couldn't have visited Bloomington on any better day. And I just loved the place from the very first moment. It was just so beautiful. And oh, how I wanted to be here. We were not very happy in Detroit. And we really longed to be in a small university town. And of course, the law school of Bloomington was a lot better than Wayne State University. So I just fell in love with the place from the very first moment that I arrived in Bloomington. And I had to wait for about a year to find out whether I could stay on, and that was a pretty long year, but it all worked out very well, and I'm very grateful for Paul deciding to go over to Ohio State, because that opened up the spot for me here.